uh, uh, MathEd forum for the current academic year. So today we'll be looking at exploring social and emotional learning, insights for mathematics education and research. And I'm glad to have our two co-organizers involved in this forum. So Dr. Robin Rutenberg-Rosen from Ontario Tech University, as well as Dr. Mark Husband from the TDSB, Toronto District School Board, who's here with us today. So just before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the Field Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences resides, which is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We would like to acknowledge and express gratitude to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples who continue to share their ancestral lands with us. A couple of quick ground rules just to make sure we're all able to run this smoothly today. We are going to have the session recorded, so if you do prefer to not have your photograph or name visible on the screen, you can you do have the ability to modify that through your Zoom settings. We do ask that you do leave your microphone on mute unless you're sharing. So that's typically going to be more of a thing in the breakout rooms today. So just to avoid any kind of excess background noise. Also just to save on folks who are on a lower bandwidth device, if you could keep your video off unless you're sharing, that would also be great. As always, we encourage you to engage in respectful discourse and create a positive and collegial atmosphere in the chat as well as in the breakout rooms. So I think at this point, I'd like to just quickly go over some of our call for reports. So if there are any reports from the folks in the meeting today from any of our mathematical organizations, the OAME, the OCMA, the OMCA, CMESG, MKN, etc., please feel free to post it in the chat. A couple of general updates to share. From the MKN, we have the critical transitions in students' mathematical development for their early years, for the primary, junior, intermediate, and all the way up. So there's some communities of practice work. Check that out on their website for MKN. That's the Math Knowledge Network. The OCMA is having their next event it looks like October 25th. So definitely something to look out for those looking at the college sector. For the OMCA, there's been a continuous set of sessions for covering de-streaming. So there's been some monthly meetings. Next one is looking to come up on May 19th on a theme of asset-based learning. There's another one on June 14th on EdCamp networking. So definitely check out the OMCA for more on that. The CMESG is going to be hosting a virtual meeting from the 11th to the 13th this June. So more info at cmesg.org. For CMS, there's also going to be a summer meeting. So that's from the 4th to the 7th of June. There's going to be 3 educational sessions around there that have been shared with us. So one is anything but calculus, alternative to teaching calculus in year 1, online math education, and transitioning to university, indigenous perspectives on post-secondary mathematics. For the OAME AFMO, there's been a series of updates around the grade 1 to 8 curriculum that was made available this fall, earlier this year. So a ton of material and supports at ontariomath.support. So definitely check out that site for more info. If there's any other reports that I've missed, please feel free to use the open chat to take us into it. But otherwise, I think I'll open up for our co-organizer today, Dr. Mark Husband.
Well, good morning. Thank you for that, Charles. I'm really excited to be here. This feels like a long time coming. Robin and I have been chatting about putting this together for a while. And about our conversation started with the launch of the new mathematics curriculum, elementary mathematics curriculum in 2020 last year. And we, of course, started to talk a lot about social emotional learning. So we're excited to have a day dedicated to, that broader discussion around emotions and feelings around affect in mathematics, or affect in mathematics. So I'm excited to be here today, and I'm thrilled to be introducing Dr. Tapo Chimganda, who is an educator, mental health practitioner, and published writer of 3 books: The Classroom as Privileged Space, #Black Love, and Who Killed Chatanga, a satirical story based in her native country, Zimbabwe. For almost 20 years, she has worked in community and nonprofit organizations, schools, and healthcare. She has taught and presented on diversity, equity and inclusion, social justice, and safe space in Australia, Finland, Ireland, Canada, and Scotland. In 2019, she founded Future Black Female, a feminist-informed organization that privileges, celebrates, and advocates for the rights and well-being of Black women and girls. Through its different programs, including a COVID response program, Future Black Female responds to the unique needs of Black female youth in Canada and beyond. I'm excited to virtually meet you here, Tapo, and I've heard so many awesome things about you. So welcome as a fellow York graduate as well.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me. And thank you to everybody else on this platform. It's certainly exciting to be here to share my thoughts, especially since I am not at all comfortable with mathematics. And so I guess just to give a little bit of background on my work, I'm a psychoanalyst, and like Mark mentioned, I'm a graduate from York University. And my relationship with mathematics has always been quite complicated. And when I was doing my dissertation, my research, I found myself working through my complicated relationship with mathematics. And I'd like to read an excerpt from my book, The Classroom as Privileged Space. And this is the section where I worked through, or was working through, my complicated relationship with mathematics. I do not recall learning maths. I can add, subtract, and do basic calculations of multiplications and divisions, probably a few fractions and simple equations. I can't solve a quadratic equation or get into the deeper mathematical stuff like geometry and calculus. More significantly, I just don't recall learning mathematics. I passed my maths exams, but not as well as I did other subjects, like chemistry, physics, and science. Chemistry made sense to me. The periodic table was like a family. You learn their names, their personalities and characteristics, and which ones to never mix or burn, and which ones are precious and rare. Physics also made sense. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Cause must always precede effect. In a theory of relativity, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. However, mathematics, I do not remember learning or understanding. I hate numbers. I'm convinced that my aversion to math is linked to the pedagogical practices of my math teachers. My sense is that my good and bad memories of learning in school correspond with the pedagogical approach of the teacher. My maths teachers in boarding school were authoritative figures. They were the 3 most feared teachers in the institution at any given time. They beat us, pinched us, and scoffed at our failed attempts at solving maths problems. One of them, a man of South Asian origin, would pinch us girls at the intimate spot between breast and armpit with a creepy grin on his face. And should a girl squirm, she risked having her breast assaulted by this man. It strikes me that I remember the pedagogy of the teachers, but cannot remember actually learning maths at school. In primary school, one teacher taught us all 4 subjects: maths, English, Ndebele, and social studies. In boarding school, we had different teachers for the 12 subjects. My homeroom teacher was also my maths teacher. She liked speaking to me in Ndebele, which is one of the major languages in Zimbabwe, during maths classes, always with a sinister grin as she scoffed and ridiculed me in a language to which I could not adequately respond. She also taught my Ndebele language lessons. Needless to say, I did not excel in that class and was often called upon to read aloud so that she could shame me. I didn't mind this much because in my mind it wasn't important and I knew I would not need Ndebele to succeed at anything that mattered to me. In the 3rd year, we were divided into more concentrated streams, arts, sciences, or a combination of the two. I was placed in the sciences stream. As I mentioned, I was good at science, chemistry, physics, biology, agriculture, and geography. I also took the compulsory English, English literature, religious education, and mathematics. The math teacher, also the deputy headmistress at the time, was a tall and robust woman who beat us with all her strength. She was a Shona woman, which is the other major language, and I am of the Shona ethnicity. So there was no language barriers between us. There were rumors she dabbled in witchcraft, and that set the fear of her in us. She had a special stick she carried with her all the time. We were unsure if it doubled as a wand. Unlike her 2 counterparts, this woman did not grin or smile as she raised her wand in swift and brutal strokes across our palms. Instead, she flared her nostrils in the semblance of a facial expression. Both my female math teachers were at the school longer than most. Needless to say, the man didn't last long. They had teaching college qualifications, which were where most of the newer and younger teachers had university degrees. Most of the newer teachers also did not beat us as much and were more creative with their pedagogy and punishment. I recall a young expatriate teacher from Canada, a Mr. Hilton, made me clean the expansive library walls with a bucket of water and toothbrush for being cheeky in his biology class. Among some of the older staff were 2 white nuns that had been at the school a very long time. They were relics of the British education system, and upon their retirement, returned to Britain somewhere to be amongst their fellow sisters. The nuns also loved to pinch us. One of them, Miss Lowe, would use the very tip of her gnarled nails, twisting her arthritic-ridden fingers so that we were twisting our entire bodies to lessen the pain. The nuns taught us home economics, which included needlework and cookery. I was especially useless in both these subject areas. That was the word I heard the most in those classes, useless. When the nuns left, the teacher who took over was a rotund Ndebele woman. She translated the term useless into Ndebele. My English literature teacher introduced us to Jane Eyre. I fell in love with the Bronte sisters and continued to read all their works periodically. His name was Mr. Mabikwa, and he was not a particularly good teacher, but he never abused his authority, beat us unnecessarily, or discriminated against us based on our ethnicity or backgrounds. He recognized my love for books and cultivated it. Whenever he was absent, he would leave me his notes so that I could dictate them to the rest of the class, as well as guide my classmates in reading the texts aloud. I felt proud of a responsibility for which I never volunteered. In his wisdom, he probably did this to keep me out of trouble, as no other student would have been able to keep me in line. But also he knew I was more advanced than my peers in my understanding of the texts. I just simply loved reading. I guided my peers through Jane Eyre and other texts like Harvest of Thorns. Another teacher who nurtured my learning was Miss Kalenga, who had studied law in university. Ms. Kalenga taught us history and English, and with each teacher, my love of learning either blossomed or withered, depending on their pedagogy. There were classes in which I paid absolutely no attention, preferring dismissal to do some manual labor outside in the bright sun as punishment rather than sit and pay attention. I was never fortunate to be kicked out of maths class, probably because I was too afraid of the teacher's wrath or wand to misbehave. But like I said, I don't remember learning maths. And so as I was doing my doctoral work, and this culminated in my first book, The Classroom as Privileged Space, I was in the Faculty of Education, and so naturally my focus was on education. And the thing that kept standing out for me was how emotional learning is, and yet we don't make room for emotion in the classroom. And I stumbled upon the idea of love and hope in the classroom. And so my entire work, my entire dissertation started to focus on what would love in the classroom look like, what would hope in the classroom look like. And for students like me who just became so averse to a certain subject, so averse that I honestly cannot remember learning anything. And the aversion extended to my primary school learning as well, because I don't remember learning addition, subtraction, anything. And I found even now when I, for example, speak to my financial advisor or accountant, the first thing I tell them is like, I'm not good with numbers, I hate numbers. And so there's always almost a defensiveness in me against numbers, against mathematics. And yet here I am today sitting in front of an entire group of people who I assume are passionate and driven by numbers and mathematics. And when Robin asked me to do this, to attend this meeting and talk to this group, I was surprised that she did that naturally, but I started to feel some of that aversion coming to the surface. And I started to think like, what could I possibly say? What could I possibly share to people that probably wouldn't understand how I feel about numbers? And as the weeks have gone on, and as I've been contemplating this morning, the word that has come up for me quite a lot is hope, the idea of hope. So I would like to read something else that focuses on this idea of hope and how it is fundamental to teaching and learning, how it is fundamental to our constructs of pedagogy, and how it is fundamental to the success of a child. In the abstract I submitted for this, I talked about the soft skills or transferable skills that employers look for regardless of your qualification or your technical skills and all of that. They want somebody who can communicate. They want somebody who's emotionally intelligent. They want somebody with a positive attitude and all these qualities. And I sum them up in this one word, hope, because when you have hope, it essentially means there's some place in you that believes I can do this, I can succeed, I can learn, I can teach. So to understand the function of hope in pedagogy and psychoanalysis, helps us reframe the investigation of social justice in education. I'm reading here a quote by Buchler, who poses some critical questions that I in turn address to education. If hope is an emotion, what gives it its motivating force? Is hope equivalent to the strength of an expectation? Is it a product of certainty about the value and attainability of a goal? How are these cognitive qualities related to the emotional experience of being inspired by hope? Can we sustain emotional hope without cognitive certainty? Is such hopefulness contagious in psychoanalysis or in education? And how is hopefulness in one partner communicated or engendered in the other? How do we understand hope's absence and its sometimes unfortunate coalescence in the lives of some psychoanalysis? An education without hope is most certainly one likely to yield a bleak outcome. Hope is curative, and the best kind of hope is steady and leads eventually to a realistic understanding of what the future can provide. To accommodate difference, education should not be claiming to be colorblind or gender neutral, for example. Rather, it should be giving each child a vision of what they can be in their individuality, whatever it may be in the future. Such a role is indeed a tall order for any individual, parent, or teacher. Nevertheless, it is what brings about social justice. Hope is inspiration, and according to Buchler, hope is tied into our emotions. In order for hope to inspire within any setting, the emotional teacher or educator must relate with the emotional learner or child. And from this relationship, the teacher is able to influence the learner's outcomes. And this is where, from a psychoanalytic perspective, we go into transference and countertransference. What then can we learn from the idea of hope? And how can educators become the vessel of hope? In other words, how can educators become more skillful at managing the difficulties and challenges of failure, of not knowing, of not remembering, of not being able to solve a mathematical problem? So the idea of hope, I'll tell you about my day yesterday. Yesterday, I had meetings from 9 and the last one finished at about 5 o'clock. And most of these meetings were in relation to equity, diversity, and inclusion. In one meeting, I spoke to a group of directors of a big organization here in Canada. In the last meeting of the day, I spoke to some frontline workers of a big organization here in Canada. And both of these groups were talking about the difficulties and challenges they've encountered in the context of EDI in their workplaces, in their duties, in their roles, and then in their expectations put upon them. And in the morning, speaking to the directors who are leadership and are assumed to have a lot of power, I just felt a sense of almost frustration, not knowing what to do and being frustrated. And there were elements of hopelessness in some of what they were saying. And one of them spoke and said, like, if you look around this table, and there was about 6 people there, including myself, we're all white, they said. And it makes it difficult to talk about diversity, to talk about inclusion as the leadership when we're all white, right? So they felt, because of what they embodied, they were losing hope in being able to successfully facilitate and implement equity, diversity, and inclusion in their organization without feeling guilt, without feeling like hypocrites. I think somebody brought up the word hypocrites. And then in the other meeting, it was with a number of Black women who had experienced some pretty traumatic racial incidents in their organization. And so I'd been asked to speak with them to help them debrief and kind of go through the things that had happened. And in this situation, again, there were elements of hopelessness. And their hopelessness was coming from a place of, our managers are all white, they wouldn't understand. We come to them over and over again with recurring issues, they don't do anything about it. And so listening to the conversation in the morning and the limitations and hopelessness from that, and then the limitations and hopelessness from the second meeting. And then I was thinking about this meeting with you guys and thinking about, when you're in a classroom, you have a teacher and a learner. And what happens when they're both feeling hopelessness from their different perspectives without having that conversation? As a learner myself, there were many times that I felt hopeless. There were many times when I felt powerless, when I felt like I'm just a student, I'm just a child, I'm just a learner. How can I say this to my teacher? How can I tell my teacher, don't hit me? How can I tell me? And this was back home in Zimbabwe, where corporal punishment wasn't that frowned upon. It is now, like, fortunately, times have changed. But when I was going through school, like, teachers had, it was like the wild, wild west with whatever weapon they could use. It was all good, right? And I remember feeling hopeless a number of times, pleading for my perspective, pleading for help, even if there was something I couldn't learn or understand. And then I also wonder, because I have been a teacher now, like, I've experienced teaching, and granted it's at post-secondary level, but there've been times when I've felt hopeless as a teacher, when I felt like, I don't know what to do about this or about these students or how to help this person, and I would feel helpless. And so yesterday, as I was reflecting, and I thought about, if these two groups, and these were two different organizations, if I brought these two groups into the same room and asked them, tell the other group how you feel and where these feelings are coming from, what and how would the conversation progress? Because they are totally opposite ends. You have the one who's perceived to have all the power, and then you have the one who's perceived to be oppressed, right? And even in my book, I talk about that dichotomy, that false dichotomy, actually, of the oppressor and the oppressed. And in math education, we have those who know and those who don't know. In any classroom, we have that, again, false dichotomy. And the one thing that I liked about my education system is every year was like a new beginning. You could start afresh. You have a new teacher. You're at a new level. If you do well that year, you could even change classes to another class where people are learning more advanced stuff. So every year was like a fresh start, a new start. But what if you lose that hope that next time I can do better? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And what happens when the teacher themselves lose hope for the student? And when we're talking about social emotional learning and emotion within the classroom, that is something that I advocate for 100%. Let emotion be what it is in the classroom. Yes, we'll have tantrums, and I would like to say when they're younger, but I've had grown students throw tantrums at me as a teacher in the middle of the classroom. And the idea of hope in social and emotional learning is basically the idea of inclusion. As long as we have hope, as long as we think that there is a way, there is a possibility, then we're still making space, we're still creating space, we're still being creative, we're still engaging with the learner, we're still engaging within our whatever position we take. I think hope is something that is absolutely critical, especially at this point in time with COVID. I still have a lot of clients that are in school, high school, and the hopelessness they feel. They were happy when they could go back to school, and now they're back online, and all I'm hearing is, I'm tired of this, I can't do this, I haven't learned anything since last year, this can't be happening. I've had parents tell me like, well, they're back online, so that's the end of schooling for them, because I'm not going to fight with my child every day. I'm the parent, not the teacher. And so hopelessness has creeped in because of this thing that even our governments and our experts can't seem to get a hold of. We don't know how long COVID is going to keep impacting our schools and our learning. And so what can hope look like within this context, especially if we as educators are the ones that are supposed to hold on to it for the sake of the people that we teach, for the sake of the parents who entrust their children to our care, to our teaching. What does hope look like when there are no immediate answers? Finally, I'd like to read a small portion again on the idea of love in the classroom. And just to, again, give some context, my work focus is mostly on social justice and space within the classroom, what social justice looks like, what it feels like. Sorry, just give me a moment. So one of the things that maybe I'll just share an experience that I had when I first started teaching. So I'd been a psychoanalyst, a therapist for quite some years before I began teaching in higher education. And I remember the first time I sat across a classroom full of students and I started talking. And as soon as I started talking, they started writing, they started typing. And I asked them, what are you doing? And they said, we're taking notes. And I said, taking notes? They said, yeah, we're taking notes, what you're saying. And I remember feeling panicked, like, why are they taking notes of what I'm saying? And this is because as a therapist, I take the notes. The client speaks, I take the notes. And it was just a really strange, I suppose, feeling to be on the opposite side of it, to see people take notes of what I'm saying, because it suddenly occurred to me, I have to be careful what I say because they're taking notes. I have to have the right answers because they're taking notes. I have to have all the knowledge because they're taking notes. And these are some of the things that, just thinking again in terms of the position of the teacher versus the student, or the student versus the teacher, And I always compare teaching to psychotherapy. And in my book, I draw a lot of comparisons around that, because I feel it is the same thing. And this is why I say the social emotional learning piece is something that we have to be mindful of, something that we have to cultivate and make space for in our classroom, because it is so crucial. Like I remember one of the things in math classrooms was whenever we were punished, you were not allowed to cry. It doesn't matter how painful it was, you were not allowed to cry. If you cried, you likely got more, or you were sent out of the classroom, or that weekend you'd be serving some sort of punishment. So we were basically hopeless in those classrooms. We had no hope. And this is the kind of teaching that killed our hope, where we were not allowed to react in an absolutely human, normal way to pain. We were expected to know the mathematics, whether we'd encountered it or not. You'd be called up, come and work it out on the blackboard. If you can't, you get punished. And that was the teaching that was going on, and how we lost hope. And so thinking in terms of the position of the teacher as the generator of hope, and the position of the student as the emotional learner, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And so I'd like to end on this idea of love in the classroom. Also thinking about what would that look like? What would that feel like? And how does a teacher show love? I had a teacher when I was in primary school, and he understood me. So in Zimbabwe, there is tribal conflict between the Ndebele and the Shona. And I am from the Shona tribe. And this teacher was from the Ndebele tribe. And he's the first Ndebele teacher that did not hold my being a Shona against me. Throughout primary school, because my family actually lived in the Ndebele region of the country, throughout primary school, I was subjected to a lot of discrimination. I was punished unfairly, unduly for things that I really shouldn't have. And it was mostly because I was Shona and my teachers were Ndebele. And so this teacher, he just understood me. And as I mentioned before, I love books. My love of books began when I was very, very small. And so whenever I finished my work quickly, he would allow me to read a book, sit down and read a book. And so it was always such a motivator for me to get my work done so I can read. And then because of that, he also decided he would start teaching us drama. And he would ask me, which books do you like? And would pick a book together, and then the class would act out the book. And this was the first time a teacher had shown me love. And it was just amazing for me. I would be eager every morning to go to school. I would have so much to say about him. I remember, like, even as I speak of him now, I can smell him, his scent. It is in my memory. And when I think of him, when I speak of him, that scent comes back to memory, because he showed me love. And I fell in love with learning because of him. And I loved him as a teacher. I absolutely loved him. And when I found out years later that he passed away, I grieved him, because he was a good teacher. He showed love, and he showed me how I could love learning, how my love of books was something special and something that, inspired the creativity within me as well. So in conclusion, I'm just sharing hope and love and the importance of the teacher's own engagement with these emotions within the classroom, expressing hope to a child, expressing love to a child or to a learner who may not know. And even then, with mathematics, I don't know if I was good at it or not because I honestly can't remember. But what I do remember are those moments where the things that I loved and the teachers that showed me love gave me hope. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate this, and I'll hand back over to Mark.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much, Tapo. I couldn't help but be thinking about this this relationship that you had between like sort of remembering and forgetting, and then sort of you brought it back at the end, like you sort of talked about it at the beginning, and then you brought it back actually at the end around the feelings and the experiences you had. And I was wondering actually, as we sort of look for some, as we wait for some questions in the chat pod, if you could elaborate on what your thoughts are on sort of remembering mathematics, and how maybe social emotional learning would support that, or how do you think it would? Yeah.
So I think the why I don't remember is because it was a traumatic experience throughout my education.
Mm.
And so when learning becomes traumatic, we don't know how the mind will react to that, how the mind will protect itself, how the mind will deal with it. I have to say, like, I grew up in a home where from time to time, my parents, corporal punishment in Zimbabwe, it's part of the culture or was part of the culture. But I was hit way more at school than anywhere else in my life. Like I experienced physical pain frequently at school, and often it was in math classrooms. And another side of this is the gendering of math and science education, where girls are often expected not to be good at mathematics. And I was in an all-girls school. So you can imagine how many of us were experiencing this regularly. And so the forgetting and remembering, I don't know if it's so much of the mathematics itself or the way it was taught that my mind has blocked out. But the result is like I couldn't, like I have nieces and nephews that like last year when they started homeschooling and I was at their homes and they're like, Auntie, can you help me with this? And I'm looking at this and I'm like, why? I don't, this is a whole lot. No, I'm sorry. And then one niece was like, but I thought you were a doctor. Don't doctors? And she was very snarky about it, which I found funny. But in her head, she was like, I'm 7 and you can't even help me with math. And apparently you have a PhD. To her, it was just like, and I said, like, I know, but let me tell you this.
Oh my, yeah, something for her wasn't adding up, right?
Yeah, it wasn't adding up because to her, she's like, and she had like, to her, it was just like, I'm 7, you're the grown up, you're supposed to know all of this. But I just don't remember mathematics. And
Yeah.
tied to the way I had to learn it, it was cruel in other words, but it also didn't inspire any kind of hope in me. And I honestly believed those teachers hated me. How
Mm.
do you learn from somebody you feel hates you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, there's some really nice comments coming in here on the chat pod. I just want to read some to you. So Heather saying, I've experienced many emotions while participating in MathEd forums, but they have never made me cry before. Thank you. And Teresa saying, it's amazing how terrible experiences allow people to recall how it felt and how these experiences provide opportunities to break the cycle and provide students with positive reinforcement to engage in lifelong learning. And we have a question coming in from Tina Rapke. Can the speaker offer suggest any concrete ideas, activities about how to open up space for social emotional learning in math classroom? Maybe something that is not specific to any math topic.
I think, and this is something I've been contemplating myself, and not just to mathematics, but to learning in general. What works in therapy is allowing people to speak about how they feel about a certain thing. If you're afraid, be able to say, I'm afraid, and work through that fear so you can get to the other side. And I think that is something we need to speak about more in education, the emotions that are stirred up in us by what we're learning, by the subjects that we teach as well. For me, like going into math classroom, I felt anxious. I felt, and in one particular class, because my last name starts with C, I was right in front of the class. So that teacher decided to sit us in alphabetical order. And so I was right in front of the class, and the number of times she called on me, like I started to hate even my last name. Like I wish my last name started with Q or O so I could be somewhere in the middle of the class, right? So the entire time I'm thinking about ways to protect myself, ways to avoid this. And what if we ask students, how are you feeling right now about this math thing? Like, let's talk about this. And I know something else, I'm working with a couple whose daughter has a learning disability, and it's only been identified in mathematics. So she's good with other subjects, but she just can't with mathematics. And so we were talking about and one of the things is to create stories around it, right? And we often do this with the younger learners. Like when they first start learning, we tell stories about numbers and all of this. But at some point, it's like, okay, you're too old for the stories. Let's just get down to the cold, hard facts. And those cold, hard facts, numbers, can be a little bit scary. So I'm not a math teacher, but what has worked for me in the situations where I teach is I just let people free associate with the content. But it's easier for me because I'm often teaching, social sciences, and life experiences and stuff like that are relevant in my classes. So I don't know if I can really offer anything, Tina, but thank you for the question.
There's a couple more comments. Amy's saying teacher as generator of hope is a wonderful idea. Being able to say that I'm afraid, very interesting dynamics involved in making that a safe action for students. And Teresa saying, it has been my experience as a teacher, the most at-risk students needed to feel that I cared and that I was willing to invest in their learning. It comes down to building relationships to open up learning opportunities for students. Joyce is saying, thank you, Tapo, for the conversation. You gave examples from your learning experience in Zimbabwe. I'm wondering if you have some examples in Canada regarding things that teachers might bring traumatic experiences in classrooms.
Yeah, so actually in my book, I also looked at the residential schooling and some of the practices that occurred in those places. One of the things being I guess the marrying of religion to education, while essentially erasing the culture, the identity, the languages of indigenous peoples. So that's where I also drew a comparison between what happened here in Canada, and in some cases is still happening here in Canada, and what happened to me when I was growing up and going to school in Zimbabwe. One of the things, especially around identity, is the name of the child. Uh, in school, sometimes they would call me by my last name instead of my first name, and I'm convinced there were some teachers who would not have even known what my first name was. They knew my last name, and that was it. And as we know here in Canada, with the indigenous people, their names and language were taken away from them, and they were left no choice but to identify with the names and language of the oppressors, basically. And so when it comes to the classroom, I think it's important what we call students. Like, we like to, and this again is from the students that I work with therapeutically, and they talk about, I'm in AP advanced and I'm in this, and like, they're labels and categories that we put them in that become a part of their identity, whether they like it or not. And it's almost difficult to shift those things. And that's why I mentioned that for me, I was fortunate to be in that particular system, because every year was a new start.
Mm-hmm.
Every year you could start again. Like, I talk about an instant when I was in grade 3. My best friend came first, and my dad came to pick me up, and the whole way home I was just bawling my eyes out, because how could she come first in class? I wanted to come first in class. It's not fair. And my dad just looked at me and shook his head and is like, well, then come first next term. It's not like you're not going back to school. And you know what? That year I did come first. And there was a great big prize giving, because there were certain years or terms where there would be a prize giving, and the person who came first. So I got to walk on stage and get my prize, and I came first, and my dad picked me up and put me on his shoulders and was walking with me on his shoulders all over the school. And like, it was awesome. It was great. And it just came about because somebody else came first, and I was jealous and bawled my eyes out. And my dad just said, then you come first. Like, nobody's stopping you. And so I did. And from that, I just learned, like, oh, okay, so when I want to, I can come first. When I want to, I can do well. And it just became a choice from year to year. Do I want to do well this year or not? Can I be bothered to put in the effort? But there was no label put on me. And I think that's really important. Some of the labels and categories that last beyond that term or that year or that teacher or that class.
Thank you. So we've got another question here. I wonder if you can comment on how love and hope can play out in classrooms where racism, low expectations, deficit mindsets are at play.
Oh my God, that would take all day. So again, going back to my book, why I did this work was when I came to Canada, it was my first experience of being Black. In Zimbabwe, I was Shona, but essentially we were all more or less Black, like even the white people, and we have a considerable South Asian population in Zimbabwe as well. We were all essentially more or less the same. And this was after independence. So you had, whether you were Indian, you were white, you were Black, we spoke Shona or Ndebele, we went to the same schools, depending obviously on socioeconomics and all of that. But the first time I was Black was when I came to Canada, and specifically when I went to college and became part of the education system. I was shocked. It was a shock to my body. I experienced racism. I experienced low expectations and just people speaking down to me. I recall one time, and this was when I was doing my master's, a new teacher walked into one of the courses I was doing, turned to me because this was in Ireland. I did my master's in Ireland. And the rest of the class was white. I was the only non-white person. I was the only Black person. And she immediately turned to me and said, listen, I know I'm going to be going pretty fast. So if you don't understand anything, just book some time with me and I can go through things with you slowly. And she said this in front of the whole class.
Oh my God.
Like, and I'm sitting there, and I remember in the class was a Polish girl and a girl from Brazil, and they could hardly understand or speak English, like, but they were white. So it never occurred to her that I might not be the one who needs extra help, but because of my skin color, there was just this expectation. And in another program, I had to insist that they do anonymous submissions because I was consistently getting the lower marks in that course. And then when we did anonymous submissions, I was consistently getting the higher marks in the course. So it was just based on my name and who I was and the color of my skin. But when that factor was taken out, because when I started getting my marks in that program, I asked my colleagues, can I read your paper? And I didn't say anything to them, but I would look at my work and look at theirs, and it just made no sense to me. So I insisted, I wrote to the dean, I wrote to the program, I wrote to as many people, and they were like, okay, we'll do anonymous submission. And that was the difference, that they didn't know who wrote what.
Wow. Wow. That's an incredible story. Yeah, wow. I'm just kind of speechless, still thinking about that, experience in the classroom that you just described. So we've got a couple more comments. Jules is saying, as I reflect about this talk, I'm thinking that teaching mathematics is not about the mathematics itself, but about the experiences that we can provide for the students to interact with the mathematics through love, hope, wonder, and beauty. I guess she's really picking up on, or sorry, they're really picking up on your idea around hope and love. And Judy's saying, I think if our teachers could appreciate mathematics as it truly is, not as it is taught, the love, beauty, wonder, and hope naturally come out. And there's a comment here from Peter saying, oh, sorry, like just actually responding to another person in the chat. Yeah, so lots of really nice comments in here about your presentation, Topo. And I think I personally loved the fact that you didn't have a PowerPoint and just spoke to us. And so I really appreciated that. It was actually refreshing. I kind of sat here and it was gripping. I was on the edge of my seat listening to you. So everything that Robin has told me about you is true, and I have certainly appreciated all your insights into social emotional learning for us as math educators to really think deeply about. So thank you for that. Any last comments? From anybody or questions? Well, Charles, I think we're going to move on to the next phase, and we have a panel. Charles, do we want to? Should I start with talking about Robin, and then we'll show the video? Sorry, I can't hear you.
So thank you very much. I guess this is where I make my exit.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. Well, thank you so much. We have certainly learned a lot from your talk, and we've really appreciated it. And lots of just wonderful comments in the chat. And thank you again, Topo.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As Mark was mentioning, we're going to be getting into a panel which has been organized to, in some sense, react to some of the ideas and thoughts that came out of this first hour of the forum. I and I'll let you introduce the panelists in just a moment, Mark, but just to give a quick brief update on how the rest of the day is going to play out, because I didn't have a moment to do that earlier. So take a couple minutes right now. So we're going to be doing an intro from Robin Rutenberg-Rosen. So she's pre-recorded this really nice sort of intro to the panel on social emotional learning, which Mark will be moderating. And once we've sort of engaged on some of these ideas within the panel, we're going to be moving on to the breakout rooms at 11:40. So those breakout rooms will be randomly allocated. We'll be using a tool called Jamboard. For many of you who've participated in forums in the past, you will be familiar with that, or if you're working in the education space, you'll probably have played with that technology as well. So within the breakout rooms, they will be randomly allocated, and we'll be getting into a little bit of detail as to what we'll be doing in those rooms later on. Once the breakout rooms take place, we'll be doing a little bit of a report back and Q&A right in the afternoon at 12:25. And then we'll be sort of breaking for open discussion at 1 and adjourning at 1:30. Just so that everyone's clear, we will be pausing all the recording at 1. So the open discussion will be left out of the recording that is posted at the end. So that's just a quick recap on the day. And I think without any further ado, I'll switch over to the prepared video from Robin.
So, Charles, I suppose just before we watch Robin, we have 4 panelists today, and Robin's going to be joining us through a video. Dr. Rutenberg-Rosen is an assistant professor of STEAM education at Ontario Tech University. Her research explores the transitions, tensions, and possibilities in the pedagogical space that occur after access in STEAM learning environments. Within these pedagogical spaces, Dr. Rutenberg-Rosen examines the intersectionality of multiple constructs that include gender, notion of ability, race, and culture. So we are going to, she's a colleague of mine, and she's joining us via YouTube video today. So we'll have a first listen to Robin.
Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Chimganda, for your talk. There's been a lot of talk about social emotional learning and mathematics lately in Ontario. Of course, because of its introduction into the new elementary mathematics curriculum. But the importance of supporting social emotional learning and its connection with mathematics education spans wider than just the elementary curriculum and longer than the K-8 grades. The importance of supporting social emotional learning spans well into post-secondary education, as our research is finding. We have been exploring issues with retention of underrepresented women around large first-year mathematics and chemistry courses in post-secondary institutions. Social and emotional support is key to retention. Just to clarify for a moment what that social and emotional support is. Research has identified social emotional support strategies that are oh so important to retention. There are a number of strategies, but I will share 3 with you today. First, mentorship, and this is all forms of mentorship: peers, faculty, community, and graduate students. Segley, 2020, tells us, mentors who push against the historical cultural of science and afford a more inviting environment are important to retention. Another social emotional support is counterspaces. Hodari, 2019, discusses a counterspace as settings where women of color can find validation, vent frustrations about racism and sexism, and express both their identities as scientists and as women of color. And the final example I want to share is creating community. Community is integral because it allows for the replacement of feelings of isolation with feelings of belonging. Our team of researchers wondered at the beginning why social emotional support was so integral to retention. Underrepresented women who make it through the pipeline to undergraduate STEM majors must have developed a strong resilience. After all, we know, we are quite aware that the systems surrounding them in their pipeline journey are not kind. Underrepresented women face all kinds of stereotype threat and other forms of oppression in their pipeline journeys to STEM majors and to our mathematics classes. Yet there they are, after all those experiences, in STEM majors. So why is social emotional support so integral after all that resilience? But here's the key. Social emotional support is not about resilience. It is about systems. It is about systemic change for the purpose of inclusion. Social emotional support is about creating spaces and systems that encourage, develop, mentor, validate, and support belonging of all learners. So it's not surprising at all that social emotional learning is important to retention. After all, can you imagine a mathematics education system, K to 16, that encourages, develops, mentors, validates, and supports belonging of all learners?
All right. So that was the intro. I'll leave it to you, Mark.
Thank you. Well, you know, when Robin and I were planning this, we actually have a student that we both taught, and his name is Lakshu Ambigay, and he's here today, and I'm super excited to share. I'm excited that he's here, and I just want to read a little bit more about him to you. Lakshu Ambi, OCT, MEd, BEd, BA, and an elementary teacher at the Toronto District School Board. His teaching experiences span across kindergarten to grade 8 in 3 diverse model schools for inner cities in Scarborough. His pedagogy embraces student well-being through student voice, agency, and culturally responsive and reflective math inquiry, with an emphasis on ensuring equity for academic achievement. His passions include educational technologies, STEAM, and problem-based solutions-focused learning opportunities. He is the proud recipient of the Zelinsky Graduate Scholarship for his work with children and youth with special needs. Lakshu currently teaches in a special education intensive support program. Welcome, Lakshu.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm going to share my screen quickly. Okay, so thank you for having me here today, and I hope I can take this opportunity to shed some light into my experiences of social emotional well-being and how it relates to the Ontario context in K to 6 or K to 8 education. My name is Lakshu Ambi, as I was introduced, and I want to share a little bit about my experiences with mathematics. I grew up in a household which was lower socioeconomic status, and a lot of my tuition, I guess, was from my parents who grew up abroad, and their education was also abroad. So a lot of their experiences with education and mathematics came from that idea or that pedagogy that was passed down onto them. So there was a lot of memorization. There was a lot of retention of facts. There was a lot of, there was a stress on being able to recall. And it goes as far as in the native language, the word for multiplication, for example, directly translates into known by the heart, meaning that you're able to recite it from your heart or from memory. So this is the kind of mathematics upbringing I had, but I wanted to change that when I was a teacher. So I want to talk a little bit about my experiences. My experiences are generally in TDSB's model schools for inner cities. And these are schools that have an identified need for additional supports, whether they be educational, social, or well-being supports, to really allow for the external factors affecting student achievement to be lessened. So for those things are such things as low income, poverty, parents' educational status, proportion of single parent families, as well as new immigrants. And this is all determined by what's called the Learning Opportunities Index. And in model schools, we are really committed to innovative teaching practices, as well as learning practices, providing supports that meet social, emotional, and physical well-being of students, as well as establishing schools as the hearts of the community. This is incredibly important because many of these communities tend to be transient, highly racialized communities that are underserved by employment opportunities and public transportation. There are two other commitments that we have, which include research, reviewing, and evaluating students and programs, as well as an ongoing commitment to sharing successful practice. So I'm highly honored to be here today to share what I've learned through my experience. We really need a starting point. So I want to start with this. This is something that we use to reflect on our practice in our classroom. And this is something that we use in our school to inform our school improvement plans. This is the TDSB's vision for learning. And this is a framework that's based on a lot of research, which I will get into in a little bit. But at the center of this, we see that the student is the focus, and we don't want to ever lose that focus. The student becomes the priority, and the student's needs and the student's well-being is the priority. And surrounding that are the features that we will discuss. So a lot of Ontario's equity policies come from these two documents: the Achieving Excellence document, a renewed vision for education in Ontario, as well as Ontario's Education Equity Action Plan. The former was released in 2014 and the latter was released in 2017. And the TDSB has really taken a lot of crucial pillars from these policy documents. So when we're thinking about public education in our schools, we think about these three major pillars. There are four, the last one being enhancing public confidence in the education system. But the three we will focus on are ensuring equity, promoting well-being, and achieving excellence. When we're thinking about ensuring equity, we need to really reflect on what barriers exist that are keeping certain students from achieving, and what biases educators might have about the ability for those students to be successful or achieve. When we're thinking about well-being, we want to think about how we might increase supports so that all students feel a sense of social and emotional well-being. In achieving excellence, we want to focus on specific targets that we want to meet in order to indicate that our students are successful. So I want to start with this quote. I had the great privilege of working with another professor, Alison Amer, Dr. Alison Amer at Ontario Tech University, and she really allowed us to delve into this inquiry as to what does it mean to be a teacher in Ontario. And this quote by Paulo Freire, who I had studied, was something that really stood out to me. And I'm going to read it. Education must begin with a solution of the teacher-student contradiction by reconciling the poles of the contradiction so that both are simultaneously teachers and students. And that's where we start with our pedagogy. The keynote speaker had talked about her experiences in education, and it really resonated with the experiences that my parents had shared as well. And if we take a look on the left-hand side, we see this idea of the banking model, where the teacher has all this power and is basically filling an empty vessel. And on the right-hand model, we see that there's a problem-based inquiry model, which we will discuss the differences between. The banking model. So what's different about the banking model? The banking model, the teacher has all the power and the privilege and the authority in the classroom. They're essentially dispositing all the information that they've learned and acquired over their many years as a teacher. And this is often replicated or reproduced in our education system because of the apprenticeship of observation. What that means is that when you're a student in a classroom and then there's a teacher in front of you that's teaching in a certain way, we're going to be more likely to replicate that when we become teachers. And so we need to really think about that and reflect on that as teachers. Students then become repositories of information. All the information that we've given them, the students hold on to. And they're expected to recall that information at a later date, whether through it's a test or an exam. They're expected to recall that information. Now, if we shift from this model into the model that which we use in our school, we would be looking at a problem-based model. The problem-based model of inquiry engages both the students and the teacher and empowers them through a process of problem-based solutions-focused thinking about our learning. The pedagogy then focuses on the students as existing within the world as opposed to preparing them for the world ahead of them. The assessments then become a measure of critical thinking, problem solving, and an application of diverse funds of knowledge from various funds that they might have from their own experiences. So shifting this thinking really requires us as educators to unlearn and relearn cultural scripts about education. It requires us to reflect on who we are as individuals, think about our own biases. So think about our stereotypes, think about our own identities, and really think about who we are as individuals. And then after loving ourselves and feeling that we are content or feeling that we are able and competent, then we can look at other people's humanities. And this is where we look at students and say, we can see their humanity, we can see their needs and their requirements for love, just as we do. So the model that I've kind of come up with in my classroom follows this approach. It's how I teach in my classroom, and I hope that it will give some insight into how it's possible to bring love into the classroom. The first area I have up here is student voice, and having students being able to express their identities, their lived experiences, their interests, and their various funds of knowledge in the classroom is so important for how they engage with the education system and how they engage with the learning. I once had an associate teacher say to me that we are not teaching the curriculum, we are teaching students. And that's something that's always stayed with me. And that idea that students have their own funds of knowledge that they come into the classroom with, and their ability to share is so important to moving forward. And then this other idea of students as agents of change. So oftentimes we feel hopeless, and this was an idea that we just had talked about. We feel hopeless and we feel that it's monotonous, or we feel like we're constantly doing the same things over and over again. For many of my students who come from apartment blocks, their lives really revolve around their apartments and coming to school. And there's very little opportunities for them to go beyond that. There isn't very many things to do within the community. And so when they come to school, it's really an opportunity as an educator to offer those opportunities for their students to see themselves as active participants in their communities. And often they don't know where to start. And by offering those opportunities and showing them how to do it, we're empowering them within their own societies, within their communities, through critical dialogue, activism, and community partnerships. Another important aspect of this is culturally responsive and reflective pedagogy. Oftentimes, I get asked why I don't use a math textbook in my classroom. And parents who come from various countries abroad, and they're often new immigrants, will be very upset with me that I don't use a math textbook in my classroom, because they seem to think that this is the way of learning. However, when it's explained that the questions or the concepts, the way that they're presented in the textbooks might not completely be relevant to our school or school community, they seem to understand. So by offering these various ways of understanding math concepts in culturally responsive and reflective pedagogy, we're able to really offer that sense of place in our community. The last aspect I want to talk about is global competency skills. So embracing the multiple and interdisciplinary literacies that we have in our classrooms is so important for nurturing a growth mindset and innovation. So I'm going to talk about one example wherein our students were looking at habitats in a grade 4 or 5 classroom. We're looking at habitats in a grade 4 or 5 classroom, and this is a science unit. And one of the things the students were really concerned about is that there weren't very many trees in their community in order to sustain wildlife in the community. And so one student went home and found this City of Toronto urban forestry map that showed a bunch of numbers he didn't quite understand, but he really wanted to know, where is our school located on this map? And that was his little question that he had. Where is your school located on this map? And so he was trying to explain to me in this picture that there are some places in the city where there are more trees, and there are some places where there are less trees. And this sparked a little bit of a discussion in our classroom, where we were able to say, okay, so what is something that we can do to prove that there are less trees in our community? So we went out into our neighborhood and we did a little math walk. And what the math walk looked like was tracking the number of trees in our classroom, in our community. And what they did was they recorded every house that had a tree in front of their yard, and every house that didn't have a tree in front of their yard on a data sheet. And then they came back into the classroom, used GIS data through My Maps on Google, and tracked every single place where there could be a tree. And then they went to the city and said, would you sponsor this activity? The city wrote back saying, this is not available to schools at this time, but if your teacher would like to put in the paperwork, we would be happy to make it happen. So essentially, we were the first school in the Toronto District School Board to push for this to be available to schools instead of just for business associations. What that meant was there were over 500 trees matched to that school community, and it got the attention of the mayor of Toronto. And he actually came out to sign a bunch of autographs for them. So think about what that meant for them in their mathematics inquiry. Their inquiry was, does our community really just have fewer trees than the rest of Toronto? And what can we do about that? And by making an effort to reach out and do something about it, they actually had an impact, or they saw they became agents of change in their own community. And when we think about mathematics, we're really making it more relevant to them. So after this event happened, they were concerned about trees for the rest of the year. So a lot of our questions went back to our math inquiry that had taken place in early September. Okay, so here's a question that I actually did for a math course with Mark Husband, but this is another example of like how we would make the question more relevant for students. So there is a lot of open-endedness in this question, and really allows for assumptions to be made. So the assumption here is that it does not rain between day 1 and day 4. But if the assumption is that it rains a little bit, that would change your data, and that could translate into a different answer. But as long as you're able to prove your thinking or show your thinking, we would allow for that to be something that is considered an accurate assumption.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. Lakshmi,
We're running out of time?
we're running out of time. Yeah. Do you want to wrap up? Do you have a couple more sentences?
I have like 2 more slides.
Okay.
Okay, so here's another example where students are looking at wheelchair access in our community and comparing it to dash robots and how they move around and calculating the distance and how that would improve accessibility if we were to have sidewalks in our community. And another example where students, particularly girls, took it upon themselves to design a device that would detect moisture levels within a plant and automatically water it using microbit and an EV3 robot. And these are grade 3 students, I should add. So this is an amazing thing that we can really allow students to achieve in these ways. And this is what I think achievement looks like through social emotional learning.
Okay. Awesome. So I'm going to stop you there. Thank you so much, Lakshu. This has been really, oh my gosh, you've got me thinking about all sorts of things, actually. So we're going to go to our next panelist, and people will come back and ask you questions.
Sure.
I'm going to skip one. I'm going to go to Judy Larson from the University of the Fraser Valley. Dr. Larson takes interest in environments that occasion mathematical thinking, the role of autonomy in mathematics classrooms, effective aspects of learning mathematics, and mathematics teacher professional growth. Her current research focuses on mathematics teacher professional learning communities, particularly via social media, and the generative possibilities of such spaces. Dr. Larson is currently an associate professor at the University of the Fraser Valley, where she teaches mathematics methods, and math for teachers courses. She's joining us all the way from BC. There's a time difference there, so we so appreciate you coming in, Judy, and take it away.
Great, thank you. What an honor to be here. This is an excellent session, so thank you for putting it on. I hope you can hear me and see my slide. Yep, I think so. So as I've been introduced, I'm Judy Larson from the University of the Fraser Valley. The University of the Fraser Valley is situated on the unceded Stolo territory, the people of the river in this beautiful valley. And the people of the river had an intrinsic relationship with the land and place. And so this used to be actually a big lake that had a lot of salmon and resources. So I always think about it when I'm here about the history of the land. And in this place, and mostly online now, but in this place, I teach a variety of learners who share one common theme, and that is coming back to learning math as adults. So I'm on the other end of the spectrum as Lakshu. I can't wait for your students to come into my classes. But for now, here's where I'm at. So I teach primarily adults, basic education, students returning to school. They're taking secondary math courses. I also teach math for elementary teachers and math methods courses. So there's a diverse range of population that I'm working with, but they seem to all share something in common when they come into a math class. And even the future secondary teachers will experience this sort of sense of, oh no, I'm going into a math class, and there's a bit of panic sometimes. And so myself, as I'm an immigrant settler from Eastern Europe, and there's a lot of pressure on succeeding in mathematics. And so I've also experienced a lot of these feelings of overwhelm and anxiety as well. So I really try to attune to that. So while I'm not an expert on social emotional learning, I really think of it as I have the social and the emotional, and there's mathematics, and how are these linked and how do these come together? And I'm very interested in attuning to the social and emotional in all of the mathematical spaces that I try to design. And so one thing is I'm just taking a practical perspective here today because we have such a short time. So I'll share a few different strategies that I've implemented and then kind of like what I've learned from them. So one thing I always do in every class is I ask students when they come in, the first thing that they have to do is to identify what math is to them. And this really teaches me about the past experiences, and it gets sort of the heebie-jeebies out. It's like, oh, we're in a math class, and here's what math is. What is math anyway? And I get all sorts of responses, but most of the time I get panels like this. And these anonymous spaces are really nice at getting out the truth. So they'll either do a whiteboard splash, or so they all go up with a marker and write down what they think math is just to get it out. This is on a Jamboard. I've used Mentimeter as well. And if you notice here, there's a lot of intensity in this one image here. And the common theme I find when I look through these set examples of what math means to learners as they come into a math class, I always notice an underlying theme of emotion. There's a lot of emotional aspects. Whoops, I went back too far, sorry. Emotional aspects that come out, as well as utilities. So you have, the baking, paying bills, those utility aspects of mathematics. But then you have these emotional aspects, so torture, tension and stress and crying. And this is probably not super unfamiliar to anyone. This one here, waiting to be picked to answer. So this experience of mathematics as an intimidating space can really play into their self-confidence in the room. And so I find one reason for getting this out at the beginning is often learners who have experienced this sort of tension will keep it to themselves and will think that they were the only ones. And so seeing that others feel this way helps them feel connected to the community and to be accepted and not the only ones. Here's another one more recent. And it's interesting because some of them say both the positive and the negative. So math is both frustrating and fun, and it's both satisfying and stressful and upsetting, and also creates accomplishment. So this is very interesting to me to see these things. So clearly mathematics has an emotional component, and I don't think we can deny that experiencing doing mathematics is going to come with some sort of emotive experience. And so what I notice as absent from a lot of those statements of what math is a social aspect of communication of ideas. And so yes, there's doing the mathematics, but there's also at some point you're going to be communicating the mathematics and representing and diagramming. And I often never see those statements in those share outs. And so when I think of the language of doing mathematics as having a component of explaining and describing and justifying, I think about that social piece, and I think about how that social piece can actually enhance the emotional space and the emotional tone and the emotional safety in the room. And how do we use, create a social community that embraces and empowers positive emotional experiences for students in mathematics. And so I'll just share a few different ways and opportunities for weaving in social emotional learning supports in classrooms of various kinds. So I find when they first come in, it's very important to me, and anyway, to set a tone of acceptance, set a tone of that it's okay to feel this way. It's okay to feel that math is a struggle, or has been a struggle. It's almost like a little therapy session on the first class sometimes. And so I'll do the what is math to you, but another strategy that I've used is to get everyone in a circle. The first thing they do is they come in, they get into a circle, and they share out who they are, why they're there, and how they feel about math. And what I find, even if every single person in the room says, I'm so-and-so and I hate math, and they go through that, it's just such a healing space for them to hear that, oh, they're not the only ones. And to see my reaction to that I don't mind that that's how they feel, but we're going to get through this and we're going to support them through this. Another thing that I found more so in the online space recently, I learned that students weren't getting in online classes when we had synchronous, even though we're doing Jamboards and breakout rooms and all of that. I'm always part of that, and there's always a mathematical component to their task. I found this term that I wanted to put into the beginning of the class just an opportunity for them to check in with each other and to check in how they're doing emotionally, not necessarily emotionally, but just where they're at. Say something supportive to your peers, encourage them, create this sort of safe space for them to check in with each other. And I'm not part of that. And I found it was hard for me to not listen in, because when they're in breakout rooms, you can't hear what they're saying. But letting go of that and giving them space to talk socially amongst each other as students was actually really helpful in building community this term online. And then I have two more. So one is how content is encountered. And this is a really big one. I think this could be a whole this is a whole session, but I'm very influenced by the Building Thinking Classrooms work of Dr. Peter Liljedahl, and also just in math education, having this space of focusing on problem solving, inquiry-based approaches, physical, contextual experiences where learners can gather and socialize without a pressure of succeeding at getting the right answer or whatever it is. I'm also aiming to decentralize my authority in these spaces. I'm really trying to remove myself from the center of that space and give power and room for opportunities for students to both fail without judgment and to succeed publicly in front of their peers. And mathematically, it's also about like sneaking up on topics to reduce the idea of these triggers that they may have had, maybe fractions as a trigger. So I'm really attentive to those things as well. And finally, the last, I know I'm probably just like 1 minute here. Finally, the idea of assessment and authentic assessment. I think assessment is a big one. It creates a lot of anxiety. And so in my assessment practices, I really try to think of it as a conversation, giving them opportunities for improvement, for ownership of learning, for reflecting on their learning, and for embracing small successes that they can have. And here's just an example of a group exam. We still call it an exam because we kind of need to have one, but it really de-stressed their, decreased the anxiety in the room when they got to talk to peers about their strategies and approaches that they might take before writing an exam, which is probably the most anxiety-provoking situation.
Yeah. Oh, I have
So, yeah.
questions even about just that image there that you put up. That's that picture. That's beautiful. But yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of fascinated by that because of my own work in teacher education and how that
Cool.
looks quite similar to like the experiences that I've been trying to provide. But thank you so much, Judy.
Thanks.
There's
Yeah.
so much.
Can I just say the last things? My last things are basically, these are my key points, is that I've learned. My takeaways is to focus on trust and empowerment for students, and being non-threatening and honoring the whole student in their journey, and not preventing them from opportunities for success.
Awesome.
There you go.
So much,
Yeah.
Judy. That was great.
Yeah.
So we have our final panelists, and we're gonna panelist named Dr. Olga Fellis, and I'm going to introduce her. She work focuses on processes of mathematical identity making and on how learning theories inform pedagogical practices, the utilization of technology in mathematics, and the learning of mathematical content. She's particularly interested in conditions that allow students to develop ownership over mathematical ideas. She has recently co-authored Closing the Gap on the Map, Davy Dove's contribution to current early algebra discourse in light of the 1960s Soviet debates over word problem solving, which was published in Educational Studies in Mathematics. A former high school teacher, Olga has worked as a teacher educator teaching classroom discourse and research methods at the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Olga.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. So I'm very happy to be here, and I will begin with my presentation without any delay. I would begin with the crisis narrative that still persists in discourse. And the last reference to the crisis narrative, I found a very interesting paper by Allison and Geloso in Davy publication in the newspaper, where they say a steady, where they note that there is a steady decline in Canada's math scores between 2003 and 2018. And so that leads us to the question, where do we go from now? And what I sense from the discourse in mathematics education, about mathematics education, is the frantic question of where do we go from here? To me, it very much looks like and feels like this confusion that was experienced back in 1967, where Sweden decided to change driving from left to right. And this is a real picture of what happened the morning of the change. Much of the discourse about what needs to be done in math education to allow more students, and we heard the beautiful, really inspiring presentations today that resonate with this feeling, where we really talk about what do we need to do to allow more students to experience positive feelings and emotions with regards to math learning. I would suggest, based on my work, that it has a lot to do with identity work, and that identity work in actual fact, and more and more research shows that there is relationship between identity work and performance in mathematics education and mathematics learning. Interestingly, I find that it all begins in children who are as young as 4 or 5 years of age. I chose to cite the work of Joe Towers from Calgary and the University of Calgary. And the reason is that it is a recent work that shows how very young children have a very concrete perception of mathematics as something that is only about numerical operations. We all know that math is not only about numerical operations. It's not about manipulating numbers. It is also about that, but it's not the most important thing about mathematics, which is something that needs to be addressed. Young children think, and they have very strong perceptions about math as being something hard to do. And that others are smart in, not they, but others are smart in math, and that it is not fun to do. And I keep thinking about what kind of experiences cause young children to develop such beliefs and emotional dispositions. This is where my work comes into the picture. I look into identity as a theoretical framework to understanding learners' dispositions towards mathematics. And I think the first step to do is really to make a difference, to differentiate between what Ricoeur showed to be idem identity and ipse identity. It's a very important distinction because, and again, not because, not for the sake of saying this is versus that, but we need to make the difference so that we can use it to help us understand the processes of identity making in the mathematics classroom. So identity, understood as idem identity, implies a sense of constant sameness to similar others. And we have lots of research in math education that allies individuals to create a unified facade, right? We have gendered mathematics, we have raced mathematics, we have work that is oriented toward the past. What were your experiences or achievement up to this point? This is how you are able or disabled to do mathematics. Idem identity also causes us to think about mathematics that is static, and that it is perceived as a substance that a person possesses. So, for example, gendered mathematics is a great, I mean, I wouldn't say great, but is a relevant example in that respect. On the other hand, IPSY identity really focuses attention on the dynamic aspects of identity making in mathematics. It implies a sense of continual development of one's self. It brings forth the diversity between individuals. It is oriented toward the possible future, and it is perceived as an idea to be continually constructed. And when I say that, I go back to what the previous speakers, each one of them said this morning about their development or their work in math education. What I think is helpful is think about identity as a multidimensional framework that we can use to put together, right? I mean, we need to think about it in distinct terms so that we can put them together for the purpose of developing confidence in mathematics classrooms. And I would just preface and say that this framework was imported from academic writing in English, and so that was work that was published back in 1998 by Rosa Ivanic, and was adopted and imported into mathematics education. And so what this framework suggests is that when we think about mathematical identity, when we think about our work as math teacher educators or mathematics teachers, we need to acknowledge the experiences students have, learners have, even teachers have, in light of of what Judy said just a few minutes ago. What kind of experiences do people have with regards to learning mathematics? And I want to emphasize and say it is not that we want to create all happy moments of sharing positive feelings. I think we need to go beyond that and acknowledge that even experiences that on the face of it seem to be negative in some respects, as long as these negative experiences do not shut down opportunities for learning, then we still need to see how these can be harnessed to the experience of mathematics learning. And so what I mean by that is that the sequence of experiences and their interpretation and relationship in terms of how they impact affect and emotional dispositions towards math are important aspects to consider. The next dimension is what Ivanic calls discursive dimension. To make it more applicable to mathematics, I think it would be useful if we think about these opportunities where we address learners as learners of mathematics, and how one is talked to and about as a learner of mathematics within the work we do. We have so much work, empirical work, that provides substance to this dimension, but I will not go into that. I'll just I would like to open the space to consider these dimensions and see how they can be used in our work. The next dimension is authorial stance. What opportunities do learners have to develop their ownership? And Judy used the word autonomy, right? Which is almost equivalent to the sense of ownership students are allowed to develop within mathematics classrooms. And the fourth interrelated dimension is the narratives and meta-narratives that we reject or align with in terms of who can do math or who cannot do math. And so I understand identity work and social emotional understanding or learning within mathematics as stories we live by, and that it's important because it's our emotional disposition about with regards to learning mathematics has a lot to do with the kind of experiences we have in learning mathematics. And I want to just to refer back to Dr. Chimganda's presentation today, where she really could not recall experiences of learning mathematics, anything that has to do with mathematics for her, and I suspect for many others throughout the world. I mean, it really is a phenomenon that crosses borders. Many of these experiences shape an attitude and emotional dispositions towards mathematics. We need to consider these as and ask ourselves, what can we do as teachers, as teacher educators, to really make the shift and be change agents? And I find that working with principals makes it easier, a bit easier, the process of shifting attitudes. I chose the principle of saving face that was introduced by Brown and Levinson in 1987. That's from the field of discourse and interaction as an important idea to work with. When we react to a student's contribution in class, do we really celebrate his or her contribution, or do we unintentionally, and I'm saying unintentionally because obviously we have, you know, things we do are all well-intentioned, right? Cause the person to lose face. So we need to think about this construct when we engage in teaching mathematics. When we think about address and attribution, I chose a quote from Hogan, who worked with students, and she noticed that when, and that again goes back to the keynote today, when it depends on the teacher, it depends on the kind of feelings and emotions a teacher evokes in a student's experiences in mathematics. And so Hogan notes, students' academic achievements in mathematics are less about their intrinsic abilities and more about how they are institutionally labeled and constructed as learners by their teacher. This is important to note and remember with regards to the way learners are addressed as capable or not capable in doing mathematics. How students are identified as mathematically competent or incompetent by self and others has been shown to be a determining aspect in one's attitude towards mathematics. And that's again a quote from Ralph Mason and Janelle McPheeters from Canada. And the last dimension I would like to refer to is the relationship between socio-emotional learning and socioculturally available selfhoods, where the narratives that are available for us all around us as learners of math are scripted or just script roles that dictate and reproduce what one can be or do or say mathematically. And I'm almost done. And so we have this beautiful quote from another paper, Institutional Practices of Streaming and Privileged Ways of Doing Mathematics Provide a Script for Performing Good at Mathematics, that works to assist other students in excluding themselves from further mathematics. The authorial identity goes back to what Lukshu talked about, how teachers play their roles as change agents. And these are the questions we need to think about when we really want to scale up change. And so we can do it by asking the right questions. I would say these may not be the perfect right questions, but at least they would be in the right direction with regards to whose point of view we privilege in our courses, and who gets to negotiate shared meanings with the teacher, and how can we allow for multiple forms of participation and sense making in our classrooms.
So yeah, you know what I love what you've done, Olga, is really nicely connected between Lakshu and Judy's presentations. I really appreciated that. Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. Wow, there's lots to unpack in all three. So I'll just open this up to anybody who has a question for any of our panelists before we move on. And because we're a little bit behind, I think we are going to move into the next activity, and we can come back later on for the open discussion and ask our panelists some questions then. Okay, this is really exciting. We have Robin and Robin has her students here. We've got Keisha, Andrew, and Caitlin that are going to be helping me orchestrate some conversations in the breakout rooms. And we're in a breakout room. We're going to be doing something called a problem tree. And they're going to help orchestrate some of those conversations. So you're going to get a breakout room, one of 4. And when you're in that breakout room, please choose the page of the Jamboard of the breakout room that you're in. Charles, is there anything you want to say about that, or should people just start to see the breakout room?
Yeah, that's a great intro. Thanks for that, Mark. So I'll be posting the Jamboard link right now so that everyone can access it. So again, oh, there we go. And once you get into your room, you'll probably want to just jump over to the appropriate page. So we got a few pages set up over there.
I can remember the word, because when we were in primary school, that was often something that we were taught, like coming into the learning space. I remember, and this wasn't just in mathematics, I don't think. I think it was just generally something that we were taught when we were small little learners, that we could put up our hand and say, I'm stuck. And so it was common practice when you're in class and you don't know what to do. Maybe there's a question or you can't spell a word or whatever it is. You just put up your hand and say, I'm stuck. And then the teacher will know to come and unstick you and help you. And so this is something that for us, or for me anyway, was quite comfortable, like being stuck. You knew what to do when you're stuck. You put up your hand. And it was almost one of those unwritten contracts with the teacher, right? You can't ignore the kid that put up her hand and said, I'm stuck. You have to go over her. And then as we got older and we started being able to unstick each other as well. So if the teacher knows that the student knows how to do the work, has done it well and successfully, and somebody else puts up their hand because you have a class of 30 kids, should say, go and help so-and-so, she's stuck. And so as we started like volunteering, if another student puts up her hand or his hand and says, I'm stuck, and we see that the teacher is busy, if you knew what you were doing, you could stand up and go and help and then come back and sit down in your seat. So being stuck wasn't, it was part of the process, and it gave people opportunities, because now I'm actually getting a bit of a memory where I had this friend who sat opposite me, and we always got in trouble for chatting. Like we'll do our work and then just get distracted. And he had ADHD as well. So I was probably not the best person to pair him with, but would sometimes get into this thing where we'll just say, I'm stuck. And then he'll be like, I'll help her. And we weren't stuck and we didn't need help. It was just a way for us to keep chatting without, being, punished or whatever for chatting. And so we'd go and unstick each other, and it became a game and became fun. So being stuck just became something that we could be creative with. and gave those who were confident an opportunity to help others.
If I may jump in, I just, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the power of habitus. What do kids get to develop as habits in mathematics classrooms? So unsticking each other can be a great habit to develop. And as you were describing this development of a self-regulation, right? To me, I interpreted it as self-regulation, where students would learn that when they see someone is in need, I don't need the teacher to tell me to go and help out, or I don't need the teacher to tell me to go to that person. It's up to me to unstuck myself. So, thank you.
And just to jump on that, I think we need to support that. We need a strong social space in the classroom for that to happen, right? There's Alex Overwick in Ontario. I think he's in Toronto, Ottawa. He when a student says, "Oh, I don't know what to do," because they're in a thinking classroom space and they're all standing in obviously pre-COVID, he comes up to the student and he literally has to point their attention at something else on someone else's board. Look, they're doing that over there. Go talk to them. And it's just this redirecting and decentralizing your authority as the source of knowledge and answering every single question, to only focus on the questions that are keep thinking questions, right? Like the ones where there's actually something to start conversing about, not how do I do this, right? Like, okay, find another resource. But we need that social space, right? Like we need to create the climate that it feels safe for them to do that. So that's beautiful, Tapo, that you had that experience where you had people to do that with in the class.
I also want to jump onto that and say it's so important, especially with mathematics, to ingrain this idea of a growth mindset in students. A lot of times students will say, I'm good at math or I'm bad at math, and it's one or the other, and it's a dichotomy between the both. But what if we started with, this is where I am in mathematics and this is where I want to go, but I'm stuck in that process. And then they start seeing that as a learning process. I'm getting better at math, as opposed to I'm always going to be bad at math. And that shift only happens when we have that social community in our classrooms that really supports students to be able to feel vulnerable and ask questions with each other and to the teacher. I also want to throw in that, especially when we're thinking about mathematics, we also need to think about the aspect of equity in the classroom. Teachers' expectations of student success is so important for their academic achievement. And we know that this is one of the leading factors in determining student success. I believe it's 3 times more than what socioeconomic status or family relationships determine in terms of success for the students. So if the teacher is the single most important thing leading to student success, how are we as the teacher going to foster a relationship with that student and all students to ensure that we have those spaces available for them to feel vulnerable, make mistakes, but also continue to grow in that process?
If I may disrupt another binary that was raised this morning, the binary between numbers and writing, numbers and reading, math and language. I sense that there is lots of this misperception going on with many teachers, many math students. I have a student who is a math teacher, and I taught in a course on inclusive classrooms. One of the requirements was engaging conversation. The very first thing he comes and says to me, Olga, I was never good with words. I'm good in math. That's what I can do. I cannot write. I cannot put thoughts in writing because I'm not good in language. I'm good with numbers. And so that dichotomy is very disturbing because it is not true. I mean, look at the beautiful work that mathematicians do in writing. You can't do you can't. To me, it's you can't be a mathematician without being able to articulate your thoughts in a clear way, right? And so we need to disrupt this. And because we are in a math ed day, my idea of a potential solution is to bring writing into the math classes and introduce, for example, journal writing, maybe not you know, on the hard copy, but keeping journals on video or just put words. There are so many ways and tools to help us bring language back to where it needs to be in math classes.
If I can go back onto that, the idea of bringing language into mathematics, I think is fantastic. So something we do in our classroom is an activity called What Doesn't Belong. There's a website that goes along with that. So you can search What Doesn't Belong. And there's a bunch of these pictures that have different images of different things, and sometimes they're numbers. And the students, there's no right answer. As long as you justify your position on which one doesn't belong, it leads to this idea that, like, I understand the problem, but I also understand a solution from my point of view, and being able to communicate that with your peers and seeing their point of view, and maybe shifting your point of view to see their point of view, is something that I think is so important, especially through language. So what we do in our classroom is students upload their answers to Flipgrid, and it's all anonymous at first. And then I go through some of the ones that I want to highlight, and then they're able to see all of them, and being able to comment on their peers and say, oh, this is really cool. I didn't see it this way at first, but now I see it. If they see a bunch of numbers and they say, oh, this one doesn't belong because it's the only even number, someone might say, oh, wait, all these other ones are multiples of 6 or whatever it is, right? So there's different ways of looking at problems and numbers. And I think that language and being able to communicate is an essential skill that we need to foster in our math classrooms to promote well-being, as well as just overall equity in the classroom.
I have a question I did post it at the end, and it was meant for Tapo. It's the big shift to the other. And I'm trying to, I'm gonna bring attention to a group of students that we normally not talk about, because when we talk about emotions, those students who do well, who are better in mathematics, who are doing great and all that kind of stuff. Tapo, you talked about your experience in Zimbabwe, you know, and I'm wondering that, by the way, my native country is Tanzania. I know Tanzania. And I had a very different experience in school, the other way around, that being loved by teachers and being like a petty student for the teachers and stuff like that. Primary school worked, but as you move on the higher grades, I think you become isolated, lonely, as regard to your relationship with your peers, because you look different, probably. You think differently. How can you love this something that is hard and whatnot? So in our experience here, there's a word for those two people. They're called Neds, right? They are awkward kid. This is an awkward kid. This is an antisocial kid. This is something like that. So I wonder, Tapo, what would you think about that side of the student who really does well, but they are a wreck when it comes to the emotions, like lonely and that kind of stuff, discriminated, joked around by peers and other people. I'm not just asking Tapo.
So in my work as a therapist, especially with young people, with children and youth, the thing that comes up the most is the bullying. And I've worked with a number of adults who still talk about being bullied in school and the life-changing impact that has on the emotional self and on the social self. And just recently I was talking to a young person about their experience, and one of the things that usually comes up is, what could I have done differently? There's a lot of self-blame, there's a lot of self-recrimination, there's a lot of not accepting the self as well, right? And it's interesting because I usually ask that question: how were your grades, or how are your grades if they're still in school? How are you doing with your schoolwork? And generally they'll be like, they're okay, they're okay. Maybe I'm having a little difficulty with history or math or whatever it is, but I'm doing okay. I think I can push through. Or, well, I do really well. And so when they're in therapy, they're not thinking about my grades. It's all the emotional and social stuff. It's bigger than life to them. And school just becomes about that. Like the grades are just almost like a byproduct or just something on the side. When you think about it, they go to school to earn these grades, right? And so for those young people, what we often end up talking about is like the emotional regulation, like even simple things like, if they don't have friends, do you know how to be a friend? And we go those like basic things, how to be a friend, how to socialize, how to be assertive. What's the difference between being passive and aggressive and assertive? What is assertiveness? And we go through assertiveness training and do all this work on them. But the reality is, and we always talk about this, is they're still going back to an environment that is not doing the work, that is not changing, that is not including them. So they do all this work, but have to keep going back. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is, especially in the context of equity seekers, and how much responsibility is put on equity seekers to change the narrative and change the situation, but everything else around them is not changing. And so that's some of the conversation we have to have. And where possible, sometimes I'll even say, would you like me to talk to your teacher or to your parents, or to see how we can have some kind of change or accommodation for you and what you're going through? And maybe, or I help them and equip them to go have those conversations themselves. Like, how can you talk to your teacher about the environment? What things can you suggest? How do you share what you're doing for your own development and what you need from your classroom or from your teacher or from your peers? How do you communicate those needs to other people? And so that in itself becomes an education on how to be social, how to be emotional in a place that is, I think a commonly used term is badland, right? Where you're likely to experience social and emotional trauma, but you're doing the work and that place or the space is not changing. Does that answer your question? Mm.
May I interject? Thank you, Joyce, as well, and Tapo. It's often come to me with group, with this helping each other learn. Like, what happens is the nerd is the one who helps the students, but they have the low social skills. So I guess, I don't know, this is more of an opinion, but there seems to be a more holistic approach to the human when we're acknowledging and building these skills for our nerds, for lack of a better word, to develop. But my caveat to that is, as math teachers, is that in our pedagogy? Is that something that we're really experts at? And my concern, I guess, also is that's a pretty fragile thing to be manipulated, like trying to support and And part of the reason I left teaching is I don't see how that's supported in the teacher to support that. You know, that's a big, even if you are loving, that's 31 students that maybe you're the only person who's loving them in the sense of acknowledging their whole person, because maybe they don't have people in their lives. Like I appreciate that, Joyce. And I guess what I'm saying is I like that this social emotional recognition is going to support our nerds to learn other skills that are going to be able to make them share their math abilities better, you know, and not just be that, you know, I'm a bookkeeper. And to be honest, it's very easy for me to play the role of warden and rule checker. You know, I'm the one that reads contracts. I'm the one that sends the email being like, well, you should check this, you know, and I'm okay with that because it's easy for everyone to accept that that's going to be my role, you know, but if it wasn't for my mom, I would not have and waitressing as a young woman, I wouldn't have the skills to interact with people and be able to do that. Thanks.
If I can also jump in and say, when we're thinking about the students who are more successful or achieving better in mathematics, there are stereotypes and biases attached to those students as well, including race identities as well as gender identities. And oftentimes in the classroom, those things are overlooked as well. And what that translates into is that here's the worksheet, finish it. When you're done, go work on an activity. As opposed to, okay, you're here now, let's move you along the learning continuum. And the other reverse side of that is assuming that the student knows everything, therefore not focusing on the fundamentals of it. So I give the example in our little breakout where students would memorize timetable facts and they would not know how to represent that in any visual format. So whether that be arrays or equal groups or repeated addition, they wouldn't know how to represent that. And that is telling because you wouldn't know where to apply it in that sense then, right? So you have to have the fundamentals down first. And so I think it's important to first think about how we're going to support all learners so that wherever they are now is where we're pushing them off from, as opposed to let's start from a random point and by the end of the year, we're going to finish this curriculum.
I just have one thing that made me think of, Kara, about just the assumption that we have about who is going to help when we ask somebody to help someone who's stuck. Like, so let's say we're going back to this stuck situation, and then if it lies in the authority of the teacher to almost direct and choose, then it becomes sort of a game of, oh, I picked you because I know you can help them. And so you have all these layers of assumptions that you're putting on the students. Alternatively, like working with the thinking classroom model, I've learned a lot about the random groupings that happen and the decentralized authority of the teacher. And what really helps, I find, just having experienced this in so many different places, because the groups are randomized very frequently, in each small group of 3, there's always a shift in terms of who is more knowledgeable in that grouping. So sometimes somebody is more successful within that grouping and they're able to teach what they know, and they begin to believe in themselves because they've actually been able to explain something to someone else. And I've seen that in journals as well. I couldn't believe I could explain this to my friend and I really understood it, because they've never been in that position before. And so then as the teacher, I can then value that, and I can devalue the student who, say, knows it all and is trying to just teach everybody. So I can come up there and say, okay, well, let's take your pen and give it to someone else and say, how do you think of this? Can you so how do I revalue value the different perspective, the alternative, rather than the sort of the know-it-all, because I think we disadvantage both sides by focusing on the people and assuming that they're going to take over. It's a very delicate thing, though, right? So yeah.
I'm a bit worried about this this identification work of those who know and those who don't know.
Yeah.
Even when as teachers we say, go and speak to Howard or Miroslav or Kim, because they know that that's an action of, if you think about what is the action that we convey through our words, that's an action of belittling. You are not good enough to know the answer, so here I am, the authority in the classroom, telling you to go to that particular Kim or Miroslav or Olga who know it. I know they know it. And so I want to think again about these practices, these habits we develop in our students, where they develop a sense of, and we talked about it in our group, ownership or authorship over content, over mathematical concepts. I want to disrupt this notion. This is someone who knows and you don't, and create a reality or classroom habits where sometimes you also know, and here is an example of where and how you can know without really positioning yourself as the one who doesn't know. So it's something that in my research, I had a student who shared an experience with me saying, so I went to the teacher because I didn't know what to do. He was a new, it was a newcomer teenager, and the teacher, and so I was thinking, should I or shouldn't I approach the teacher? Because if I get up, everybody will know, oh, she needs help. So that's, again, going back to this face saving or face building, thank you, Howard, notion. What does the student emotionally brings herself to doing, and then approaching the teacher, and the teacher ends up saying, you should know it, or go to Kim and she will help you. That shut down for that particular participant, research participant, that shut down, she said, I was just not caring anymore. I couldn't do anything to the end of the class.
So this conversation is not over, but the Q&A session is. And so this marks sort of the, I guess, the soft adjournment of the main portion of the forum today. And I want to, before we continue into the open discussion, I want to just give a big thank you to Robin and to Mark for co-organizing this session for us today. And also to our speaker, our panelists, and also our facilitators in the breakout rooms. I think you guys all did a great job at having a great talk all the way through. So there's one announcement I just want to make. It is the final forum of the academic year. So the next time we'll be meeting is September 25th in the fall. Likely we will be virtual at that time. Who knows? Let's see how the rollout goes for the vaccines and everything. But we are going to be sending out the invitation shortly before the start of the new school year. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share a feedback form. It's the same one if you've seen this in previous months. And so, you know, feel free to fill in anything that you feel is appropriate there. But really, as the steering committee, you know, we all really use this information that you feed back to tweak and modify the form every year, and take some time and over the summer as well to discuss how best to, you know, bring in the best possible structures to have these kinds of conversations as like we're having today. And so if there's any thoughts, ideas, or general feedback you'd like to give either on today's session or on everything from the preceding year, please feel free to jump into that link and let us know. And with that, I'll be ending the recording. And
first, very quickly, since this is the last meeting of the academic year, I just want to say thank you to the co-chairs of the steering committee, Joyce and Charles, for leading us this year. It was a transition year onto online, and a special shout out to Kara Jordan, who's done a lot of the tech support. So thanks everybody. This was a great year, and you guys led the charge, and we appreciate it.
Back
Thank
at
you.
there, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This would not happen if not with participants and everybody, the steering committee and everybody, the organizers and everything, right? That's a collective, right, work.
And also thanks for the big support from Fields for supporting the forum over many decades.
Yeah, absolutely.